The morning of April 13th in Philadelphia arrived with a hesitant spring that could not decide whether to embrace warmth or retreat into the lingering cold of winter. The sky hung low and gray over the brick townhouses of Rittenhouse Square, where the wealthy families maintained their pristine residences behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Inside the Thompson residence on the corner of 18th and Walnut, the household staff had been awake since 4 in the morning, preparing for what should have been the social event of the season. Eleanor Hayes stood before the tall mirror in the upstairs dressing room, her hands trembling as she stared at the reflection that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The wedding dress she wore was magnificent, a creation of ivory silk and French lace that cascaded down her slender frame in elegant folds that caught the pale morning light filtering through the lace curtains. The bodice was intricately embroidered with seed pearls arranged in delicate floral patterns, and the high collar featured Valenciennes lace that brushed against her jawline. The sleeves were long and fitted, ending in points over her hands, and the skirt fell in a graceful train that would sweep behind her as she walked down the aisle of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in just 3 hours. But the dress did not belong to her. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the weight of the previous evening pressing down on her chest like a physical burden. Her own wedding dress, commissioned 6 months earlier from Madame Rousseau's exclusive boutique on Chestnut Street, had been delivered to the Thompson residence yesterday afternoon in preparation for today's ceremony. Eleanor had been at the final fitting just 2 days prior, and everything had been perfect. The dress had fit her like a second skin, the measurements precise, the alterations complete. She had stood in Madame Rousseau's gilded fitting room, surrounded by mirrors, feeling like a princess from a storybook her mother had read to her as a child. But when the delivery had arrived yesterday, something had gone terribly wrong. The box that the shop assistant brought to the door contained a dress, certainly, but not Eleanor's dress. This gown was similar in style, crafted in the same period's fashion with the high collar and long sleeves that were currently in vogue, but the details were different. The embroidery pattern was not the one Eleanor had chosen. The lace was a slightly different shade. Most tellingly, when Eleanor had tried it on in a panic last evening, the fit was slightly off, loose in some places where her own dress had been snug, tight in others where it should have given. The realization had struck her with the force of a locomotive. The boutique had mixed up the orders. Some other bride in Philadelphia was receiving Eleanor's carefully chosen, perfectly fitted dress, while Eleanor stood wearing a stranger's gown on the most important day of her life. The discovery had sent the Thompson household into chaos. Eleanor's mother, Catherine Hayes, had immediately dispatched a servant to Madame Rousseau's shop, but the boutique had already closed for the evening. The servant returned with the news that the establishment would not open until 10 o'clock the following morning, which would be too late. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and Eleanor needed to be dressed and ready to depart for the church by 10:30 at the latest. Catherine had spent the evening in a state of controlled hysteria, her face pale and drawn as she examined every option. Could they postpone the wedding? Impossible. The church was reserved, the guests had been invited, the reception at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel was prepared with food for 200 people. Could they track down Madame Rousseau at her home? No one knew where the dressmaker lived, and the Philadelphia directory listed only the business address. Could they alter this dress to fit Eleanor properly? There was no time, and besides, the household staff did not possess the skills required for such delicate work that in the end, Catherine had made the decision that Eleanor would wear the mismatched dress. It was beautiful, she reasoned, and most of the guests would never know it was not the dress Eleanor had ordered. Only the immediate family had seen Eleanor at her fittings, and they would say nothing. The situation was not ideal, but it was not a catastrophe. Eleanor would still be a beautiful bride, and James Whitmore, her groom, would not notice or care about the subtle differences in lace patterns and embroidery. But Eleanor cared. She cared desperately. As she stood before the mirror this morning, she felt like an imposter, a fraud wearing another woman's dream. Every bride spent months planning her dress, agonizing over every detail, ensuring that the gown reflected her personality and vision for her special day. Eleanor had done all of that, and now she would walk down the aisle in a stranger's dress, carrying someone else's hopes and dreams on her shoulders. The door to the dressing room opened, and Catherine entered carrying a small wooden box. Eleanor's mother was a handsome woman of 45, her dark hair barely touched with gray, her posture still straight and elegant despite the stress of the past 12 hours. She wore a dress of deep burgundy silk, appropriate for the mother of the bride, and her face bore the carefully maintained composure that had been drilled into her since girlhood. Ladies of Philadelphia society did not show distress in public, no matter what private turmoil they might feel. Catherine set the box on the dressing table and opened it to reveal the Hayes family pearls, 3 strands of perfectly matched pearls that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. She approached Eleanor and fastened the necklace around her daughter's throat, her fingers efficient despite the emotional weight of the moment. The pearls settled against Eleanor's collarbones, cool and smooth against her skin. Eleanor met her mother's eyes in the mirror. Catherine's expression softened for just a moment, allowing a glimpse of the worry and regret beneath the social mask. She placed her hands on Eleanor's shoulders and spoke in a low voice, careful that the household staff bustling in the hallway would not overhear. "The dress looks beautiful on you," Catherine said. "No one will know it is not yours. You will be a radiant bride, and James will be honored to call you his wife. This small mishap will not diminish the importance of this day or the life you are beginning." Eleanor wanted to believe her mother's words, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach refused to loosen. The dress felt like a lie, and she was about to walk into a church full of people and make sacred vows while wearing that lie against her skin. She thought of the unknown woman who was supposed to wear this gown, who had probably spent months planning and dreaming just as Eleanor had. That woman would open her delivery today and find Eleanor's dress waiting for her, and Eleanor wondered if she would feel the same sense of violation and loss. Catherine left the room to check on the arrival of the carriages that would transport the bridal party to the church. Eleanor remained before the mirror, studying every detail of the dress that should have been hers but was not. She noticed how the waist sat slightly higher than it should, how the train seemed just a fraction too long, how the sleeves were tight around her upper arms in a way that her own dress had not been. These were small differences, perhaps imperceptible to anyone who did not know her intimately, but to Eleanor they felt enormous. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Eleanor's younger sister, Margaret, who was serving as maid of honor. Margaret was 18, 4 years younger than Eleanor, with the same dark hair and gray eyes that ran in the Hayes family. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that complemented the wedding colors, and her face was flushed with excitement. Margaret had always been the more carefree of the 2 sisters, less burdened by the expectations that fell on Eleanor as the eldest daughter. Margaret entered the room chattering about the guests who were already arriving at the church, about how handsome James looked in his morning coat, about the flowers that decorated the altar. She seemed not to notice Eleanor's distress, or perhaps she had been instructed by their mother to maintain a cheerful demeanor to help ease Eleanor's nerves. Margaret circled Eleanor, adjusting the train of the dress, smoothing a wrinkle in the fabric, her hands constantly in motion. The sound of church bells in the distance marked the passage of time. It was now past 10 o'clock, and the household was in its final preparations. Eleanor's father, Robert Hayes, appeared in the doorway wearing his formal morning suit. He was a successful banker, respected throughout Philadelphia's financial district, and his presence commanded a natural authority. But when he looked at his eldest daughter, his expression softened with paternal affection and pride. He extended his hand to Eleanor and told her it was time to leave for the church. The carriage ride to St. Mark's passed in a blur for Eleanor. She sat beside her father while Margaret and Catherine rode in a second carriage behind them. The streets of Philadelphia rolled past the window, showing the familiar sights of the city where Eleanor had lived her entire life. They passed the Academy of Music where Eleanor had attended concerts, the public squares where she had walked with friends, the shops where she had made purchases with her mother. Everything looked the same as it always had, but Eleanor felt fundamentally changed, as though the mismatched dress had transformed her into someone she did not recognize. Robert Hayes sensed his daughter's distress and attempted conversation to distract her. He spoke of James Whitmore and what a fine young man he was, how fortunate Eleanor was to be marrying into such a respected family. The Whitmores were old Philadelphia money, their wealth dating back 3 generations to textile mills and railroad investments. James himself was 28, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, currently working in his father's banking firm. The match was considered highly advantageous by both families, a union that would strengthen social and business connections. Eleanor had known James for 2 years, having met him at a charity ball organized by her mother's social circle. Their courtship had been proper and traditional, conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones and family members. James was handsome in a conventional way, with light brown hair and blue eyes, always impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite. He had proposed to Eleanor 6 months ago in the Hayes family parlor, with both sets of parents present, and Eleanor had accepted because it was what everyone expected of her. She liked James well enough, respected his intelligence and good character, and believed they would build a comfortable life together. But as the carriage approached the church, Eleanor realized that she did not love James with the passionate intensity she had read about in novels or heard whispered about by her more romantic friends. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and shared social standing, which her mother assured her was a more solid foundation than fleeting emotion. Love would grow over time, Catherine had told her, nurtured by years of partnership and shared experiences. Eleanor had believed this wisdom, or at least had not questioned it, until this moment when the wrong dress made her wonder if she was making the right choice. The carriage stopped in front of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, a Gothic revival structure of gray stone with a tall spire that dominated the surrounding neighborhood. The church was one of the finest in Philadelphia, its interior filled with stained glass windows and carved wooden pews. Guests were still arriving, stepping out of carriages and automobiles, the women in their finest dresses and elaborate hats, the men in morning coats and top hats. Eleanor could see familiar faces in the crowd, family friends and business associates, members of her parents' social circle who had known her since childhood. Robert Hayes helped Eleanor from the carriage, and Margaret rushed forward to arrange the train of the dress so it would not drag on the sidewalk. Catherine appeared and issued final instructions, reminding Eleanor to walk slowly, to keep her head up, to smile. The weight of expectations pressed down on Eleanor from all sides, and she felt as though she were being carried along by forces beyond her control, swept toward a future that had been planned for her rather than chosen by her. The wedding party assembled in the vestibule of the church. Eleanor could hear the organ music filtering through the closed doors, could hear the rustling of the congregation taking their seats. Through the narrow windows beside the doors, she caught a glimpse of James standing at the altar with his best man, his back straight and his hands clasped in front of him. He looked confident and composed, ready to take on the responsibilities of marriage. The doors opened, and the processional began. Margaret walked down the aisle first, moving in time with the music, followed by 2 junior bridesmaids, daughters of family friends. Then came the moment when Eleanor would make her entrance on her father's arm, and everyone in the church would turn to watch her. She took a deep breath, feeling the restrictive bodice of the wrong dress pressing against her ribs, and stepped forward into the sanctuary. The church was more beautiful than Eleanor had imagined during all her planning. The late morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, creating pools of colored light on the stone floor. White roses and lilies decorated every pew, their fragrance filling the air. 200 guests rose to their feet as Eleanor appeared, and she could feel their eyes on her, assessing, admiring, judging. She kept her gaze fixed on James at the altar, using him as an anchor point to keep herself moving forward. Robert Hayes walked slowly, matching his pace to Eleanor's, his hand firm under her arm. Eleanor's mind raced with thoughts she could not control. What if someone recognized that the dress was not hers? What if the real owner of this dress was somewhere in the congregation, able to identify her own gown at a glance? What if this terrible mistake was discovered before she could reach the altar, before she could complete the vows that would transform her from Eleanor Hayes into Eleanor Whitmore? They were halfway down the aisle when Eleanor's eyes were drawn to a woman seated in one of the pews on the bride's side of the church. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a dark green dress with a fashionable hat decorated with feathers. She was staring at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor could not quite interpret. It was not the polite admiration that showed on the faces of the other guests, but something more intense, more focused. The woman's eyes moved from Eleanor's face down to the dress, studying it with an attention that made Eleanor's heart begin to race. Eleanor forced herself to look away and continue walking, but she could feel the woman's gaze following her. The distance to the altar seemed to stretch impossibly long, each step taking an eternity. Finally, she and her father reached the front of the church, and Robert Hayes placed Eleanor's hand in James's hand, a symbolic transfer of responsibility from father to husband. James smiled at Eleanor, and she tried to smile back, but her face felt frozen. The minister, Reverend Thornton, opened his prayer book and began the ceremony. His voice was deep and sonorous, filling the church with the familiar words of the marriage service. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Eleanor heard the words as if from a great distance, her attention divided between the ceremony taking place and the woman in the green dress who was still watching her with that strange, intense expression. James held Eleanor's hand throughout the opening prayers and scripture readings. His hand was warm and dry, his grip gentle but firm. Eleanor tried to focus on this physical connection, tried to ground herself in the reality of the moment, but her mind kept returning to the dress she wore and the growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. The ceremony proceeded through its traditional stages. The minister spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, about the commitment and sacrifice required to build a successful union. He read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, never failing. The words washed over Eleanor without fully penetrating her consciousness. She was aware of James beside her, of the congregation watching, of her parents in the front pew, of Margaret standing behind her ready to hold her bouquet. But increasingly, she was aware of the woman in green, who had not taken her eyes off Eleanor since the processional. When the time came for the vows, James spoke his promises in a clear, steady voice. I, James Whitmore, take thee, Eleanor Hayes, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. His blue eyes met Eleanor's gray ones, and she saw in them sincerity and commitment. James was a good man, she reminded herself. He would be a faithful husband, a responsible provider, a respectable partner in life. Then it was Eleanor's turn to speak the vows that would bind her to James for the rest of her life. She opened her mouth to begin, but before she could form the first words, a sound from the congregation interrupted the ceremony. It was not a loud sound, but in the hushed sanctuary, it was clearly audible. Someone had gasped, a sharp intake of breath that spoke of shock or recognition that Eleanor's eyes immediately went to the woman in green, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears. The woman was standing, half risen from her pew, one hand pressed to her mouth and the other pointing directly at Eleanor. More specifically, pointing at Eleanor's dress. The woman's face had gone pale, and her eyes were wide with disbelief and something that looked like anger. The moment stretched out like taffy pulled thin, time seeming to slow as the congregation became aware that something unexpected was happening. Reverend Thornton paused mid-sentence, his prayer book still open in his hands, his eyes moving from Eleanor to the woman in green who was now fully standing in her pew. James's hand tightened around Eleanor's, and she could feel confusion radiating from him. In the front pew, Catherine Hayes had gone rigid, her face displaying the first cracks in her carefully maintained composure. The woman in green took a step forward into the aisle, her voice cutting through the silence of the church. "That is my dress," she said, and though she did not shout, her words carried clearly to every corner of the sanctuary. "That is my wedding dress. I would know it anywhere. I chose every detail myself." A murmur ran through the congregation like wind through wheat, heads turning, whispers beginning. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, felt her knees begin to weaken beneath her. The nightmare she had feared since the moment she discovered the mistake had materialized in the worst possible way, in front of everyone she knew, at the moment when she was supposed to be making the most important commitment of her life. James released Eleanor's hand and turned to face the woman, his expression shifting from confusion to defensive anger. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his family name and social position, "I must ask you to be seated. You are disrupting a sacred ceremony. This is Miss Hayes's wedding dress, purchased from Madame Rousseau's boutique according to her specifications." But the woman in green did not back down. She moved fully into the aisle now, walking toward the altar with determined steps. Her voice remained steady, though Eleanor could hear the emotions straining beneath it. "No, sir, you are mistaken. That dress was made for me. I ordered it 4 months ago. I had 3 fittings at Madame Rousseau's establishment. That embroidery pattern was designed specifically based on a cameo brooch that belonged to my grandmother. I can prove it." The woman reached the front of the church and stood facing Eleanor directly. Up close, Eleanor could see that she was younger than she had first appeared, perhaps 25 or 26, with auburn hair arranged beneath her hat and hazel eyes that blazed with a mixture of indignation and pain. The woman reached out as if to touch the dress, then pulled her hand back, as if the gown were something sacred that should not be violated. Eleanor found her voice, though it came out weak and trembling. "There has been a mistake," she managed to say. "The boutique delivered the wrong dress yesterday evening. It was too late to correct the error. I am wearing this dress through no fault of my own." The woman's expression shifted slightly, some of the anger giving way to understanding, but the hurt remained. "Then you knew," she said. "You knew this was not your dress, and you chose to wear it anyway. You chose to stand in a church and make vows in a gown that represents another woman's hopes and dreams." The accusation hung in the air, and Eleanor had no defense against it because it was fundamentally true. She had known the dress was not hers, and she had worn it anyway because her mother and social convention had deemed it necessary. But hearing the truth spoken aloud by the woman who was the rightful owner of the dress made Eleanor's choice seem not practical but cruel, a violation of something intimate and personal. Catherine Hayes could no longer remain silent. She rose from her pew and approached the altar, her voice sharp with the authority of social superiority. "Young woman, I do not know who you are, but your behavior is completely inappropriate. This is a private ceremony, and you have no right to interrupt it with wild accusations. I suggest you leave immediately before I have the ushers escort you out." The woman turned to face Catherine, and Eleanor saw a flash of defiance in her eyes that suggested she was not easily cowed by social hierarchy. "My name is Clara Brennan," she said, "and I have every right to reclaim what belongs to me. That dress was to be worn at my own wedding, which was to take place next Saturday at this very church. I spent 2 months' wages from my position as a secretary to afford it. It is the most expensive thing I have ever owned. And now I find it on another woman's back, being used for her ceremony when mine has not yet occurred." The revelation that Clara was a working woman, not a member of Philadelphia's upper class, added another layer of complexity to the situation. Eleanor could see the calculation happening behind her mother's eyes. The assessment of whether Clara's social position meant her claim could be more easily dismissed. But Eleanor also saw something else in her mother's face, a flicker of uncertainty, because Clara's story rang with authenticity. The specific details about the embroidery pattern, the connection to a grandmother's brooch, the mention of multiple fittings, these were not things someone could fabricate on the spot. James stepped forward, positioning himself between Eleanor and Clara in a protective gesture that would have been touching if the situation had not been so mortifying. "Miss Brennan," he said, attempting to use reason and diplomacy, "I appreciate your distress, but this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. The ceremony has already begun. Legal vows have not yet been exchanged, but we are before God and this congregation. Whatever error may have occurred with the dress shops, it can be addressed after the wedding is complete." But Clara shook her head firmly. "No, Mr. Whitmore. With all respect, I cannot allow this to continue. That dress is mine. It was made for my body, for my wedding day, for my future. Every stitch of that embroidery was chosen by me. The lace was selected by me. I have a receipt at home with every specification documented. If Miss Hayes completes her vows in my dress, it will feel as though she has stolen not just a garment but a piece of my life." The church was utterly silent now, every person in the congregation transfixed by the drama unfolding at the altar. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, could sense the shift in the atmosphere from celebration to scandal. This would be the story that people told for years, the wedding that was interrupted by a working girl claiming the bride wore her dress. Eleanor's reputation, her family's reputation, would be permanently marked by this moment. Reverend Thornton, who had been standing paralyzed during the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "we should retire to the vestry to discuss this matter privately. This sanctuary is a house of God, and we should seek a peaceful resolution that honors all parties." But before anyone could respond to this suggestion, another voice spoke from the congregation. It was Robert Hayes, Eleanor's father, who had remained silent until now. He approached the group at the altar, his face grave but his manner authoritative. "Miss Brennan," he said, addressing Clara directly, "you have made a serious accusation. Do you have proof that this dress belongs to you?" Clara nodded immediately. "I have the receipt and specification sheet at my boarding house, 3 blocks from here. I can retrieve them within 15 minutes. They will show every detail of the dress, including the exact number of pearls in the embroidery and the specific pattern of the lace. I can also bring witnesses who saw me at my fittings, including the shop assistant who took my measurements." Robert considered this, then turned to Catherine. "Did you save the paperwork from Eleanor's dress order?" Catherine's face revealed the answer before she spoke. The specification sheet had been filed away at home, not brought to the church because no one had anticipated needing proof of ownership of a wedding dress. The situation was spiraling further out of control, and Eleanor felt increasingly like a passive observer in her own life story. She looked down at the dress she wore, really seeing it for the first time as Clara's dream rather than her own. The embroidery that Eleanor had found slightly wrong now appeared intentional and specific, the pattern of flowers and vines that must have meant something particular to Clara. The lace that seemed an odd shade was perhaps a perfect match to something important in Clara's life. This was not just any dress, it was Clara's dress, as personal and unique as a diary or a love letter. Eleanor made a decision. Her voice came out stronger than it had been before, carrying a conviction that surprised even herself. "Stop," she said, and everyone turned to look at her. "We need to stop this ceremony. Clara's right. This is her dress. I can feel it now. The way it fits, the details that seemed wrong to me, they were right for her. We cannot continue." James stared at Eleanor as if she had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. "Eleanor, what are you saying? We are in the middle of our wedding ceremony. Whatever the confusion about the dress, it is just a garment. It does not change what we are here to do." But Eleanor shook her head, feeling a clarity descending on her that cut through the panic and embarrassment. "It is not just a garment, James. It is Clara's dress, and I am wearing it without permission, without right. How can I make sacred vows while participating in something that feels fundamentally dishonest? How can I promise to honor and cherish you when I cannot honor this woman's property and feelings?" Catherine reached for Eleanor's arm, her grip tight and urgent. "Eleanor, do not be foolish. Think about what you are saying. Think about the guests, the reception that is prepared, the life you and James have planned. A dress is not worth throwing all of that away." But Eleanor pulled her arm free, and in that gesture, she felt something shift inside her, some locked door opening. "Maybe that is the problem, Mother. Maybe I have been so focused on the plans and the expectations and the life that everyone else designed for me that I have not stopped to consider what I actually want. And I know, with absolute certainty, that I do not want to begin my marriage by wearing another woman's dream." The church erupted in whispered conversations, the guests no longer able to maintain even the pretense of polite silence. Eleanor could hear fragments of commentary, expressions of shock and speculation. She saw her younger sister Margaret standing to the side, her face a mixture of confusion and admiration. She saw James's parents in the front pew, their faces rigid with displeasure. She saw the wedding party, the bridesmaids and groomsmen, frozen in their positions like actors in a play that had suddenly gone off script. James took Eleanor's hands in his expression intense and pleading. "Eleanor, listen to me. You are having a moment of nervousness, which is completely understandable. Every bride experiences doubts on her wedding day. But we can work through this. We will compensate Miss Brennan for the dress. We will buy her a new one, something even more beautiful. This does not have to end our wedding." But Eleanor saw in James's face what she had been trying not to see for months. He did not understand her, not really. He saw the situation in terms of transactions and solutions, problems to be fixed with money and social negotiation. He did not see that the issue was not about the dress itself but about what it represented, about Eleanor's willingness to participate in something that felt wrong simply because it was convenient and expected. Clara had been watching this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read. When Eleanor looked at her, Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself. "My fiancé, Daniel, is a carpenter. We have been saving for 2 years to afford a wedding. The dress was the one extravagance I allowed myself, the one thing that was just for me. He does not even know yet what happened, that the boutique sent my dress to the wrong address. I came to the church today because I was delivering the programs for my own wedding next week, and I saw the carriages arriving, and I thought I would peek inside to see another bride's happiness. And then I saw my dress walking down the aisle on someone else. The pain in Clara's voice was raw and real, and Eleanor felt it like a physical blow. This was not about class or money or social position. This was about 2 women who had both tried to create something meaningful in their lives, and a careless error that had entangled their stories in a way that neither had wanted or deserved. Eleanor reached up to the pearl necklace at her throat, her grandmother's pearls that represented generations of Hayes family tradition. She unfastened the clasp and held the necklace in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the smooth perfection of each pearl. Then she turned to Clara and held out the necklace. "Take these," she said. "They are worth far more than any dress. Sell them and buy yourself a new gown, something even more beautiful than this one. And please accept my sincere apology for the distress I have caused you, even though it was unintentional." Clara stared at the pearls, clearly shocked by the offer. "I cannot accept that," she said. "Those are family heirlooms. They mean something to you." Eleanor pressed the necklace into Clara's hand, closing Clara's fingers around the pearls. "They mean something to my family's past," she said. "But your dress means something to your future. That is more important." The gesture seemed to break something in the atmosphere of the church, some of the tension draining away as people recognized a moment of genuine human connection in the midst of the social disaster. But the fundamental problem remained unresolved. Eleanor was still wearing Clara's dress, still standing at an altar where a ceremony had been interrupted, still facing James, who was waiting for her to make a decision about their future. Reverend Thornton, recognizing that his role as spiritual guide required him to take action, stepped forward. "My children," he said, addressing Eleanor and James with pastoral gentleness, "this is clearly a situation that requires more than can be resolved in this moment. I propose that we adjourn the ceremony and reconvene when the proper arrangements can be made. Love is patient, as the scripture tells us, and if your commitment is true, it will withstand this temporary delay." That James's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "We cannot simply adjourn a wedding," he said sharply. 200 guests are sitting in this church. A reception is prepared. This is not a matter of patience but of completion. But Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief at the minister's suggestion. "Actually," she said quietly, "I think that is exactly what we need to do. James, I am sorry, but I cannot complete these vows today. Not like this. Not in this dress. Not with these doubts." The walk back down the aisle of St. Mark's Episcopal Church was nothing like Eleanor had imagined during all the months of planning her wedding. Instead of moving in a stately processional on her new husband's arm, acknowledged and celebrated by family and friends, she fled through the sanctuary alone, her hands gathering up the train of Clara Brennan's dress to keep from tripping, her face burning with humiliation. The congregation parted before her like the Red Sea before Moses, guests pressing back into their pews to let her pass, their faces displaying various combinations of shock, sympathy, and barely concealed delight at witnessing such spectacular social drama. Behind Eleanor, she could hear raised voices, her mother's sharp tone attempting to restore order, her father's deeper voice trying to calm the situation, James calling her name with increasing desperation. But Eleanor did not stop, did not turn around, did not acknowledge any of them. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the church and emerged into the gray afternoon, where a light rain had begun to fall, as if the weather itself were responding to the catastrophe inside. The street outside the church was lined with the carriages and automobiles that had brought the wedding guests, their drivers waiting patiently for the ceremony to conclude so they could transport their passengers to the reception at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Eleanor stumbled toward the nearest carriage, not caring whose it was, climbing inside and pulling the door shut behind her. She huddled in the corner of the seat, finally allowing herself to cry, the tears that had been threatening since she first looked at herself in the mirror that morning now flowing freely. She did not know how long she sat there before the carriage door opened again. She looked up expecting to see her mother or James, but instead found Clara Brennan standing in the rain, holding her hat against the wind that had picked up. Clara climbed into the carriage without asking permission and sat across from Eleanor, the two women regarding each other in the dim interior. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara reached into her handbag and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to Eleanor. It was a simple gesture, practical and kind, and it made Eleanor cry harder. She took the handkerchief and pressed it to her face, trying to regain some measure of composure. "I am so sorry," Eleanor said when she could speak again. "Not just about the dress, but about everything. About the way my mother spoke to you. About the assumption that we could simply take what was yours because we had the social position to do so. About all of it." Clara studied Eleanor's face with those keen hazel eyes that had first spotted her dress from the pews. "You really did not know it was mine until you put it on, did you?" "It was the shop's mistake." Eleanor shook her head. "I ordered my dress 6 months ago. I had fittings. Everything was perfect. But when the delivery came yesterday evening, it was your dress instead of mine. My mother decided I should wear it anyway rather than postpone the wedding. I went along with it because that is what I always do. I go along with what is expected of me." Clara leaned back against the carriage seat, her expression thoughtful. "That must be a lonely way to live," she said quietly. "Always doing what others want. Never choosing for yourself." The observation cut deeply because it was true. Eleanor had spent 22 years being the dutiful daughter, the perfect young lady of Philadelphia society. She had attended the right schools, made the right friends, participated in the right social activities. Her engagement to James had been celebrated as an ideal match, and Eleanor had never questioned whether it was what she truly wanted because she had not been raised to ask such questions. Women of her class were expected to make advantageous marriages, to manage households efficiently, to produce children who would continue the family legacy. Personal happiness was considered a fortunate bonus, not a requirement. But sitting in that carriage, still wearing Clara's dress, having just walked away from her own wedding, Eleanor realized that she could not continue living that way. Something had broken inside her, or perhaps something had been freed. She could not marry James, not today, not ever, because she did not love him the way a woman should love the man she promises to spend her life with. And she could not spend the rest of her days being guided by her mother's ambitions and society's expectations. "What will you do?" Clara asked, and Eleanor heard genuine concern in her voice, as if they were friends rather than strangers thrown together by a dressmaker's error. "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. "I have never not known what I was supposed to do next. There was always a plan, always a schedule, always someone telling me the proper path forward." Clara smiled slightly. "Then perhaps that is the gift in all of this disaster. Perhaps now you get to decide for yourself." Before Eleanor could respond, the carriage door opened again, and this time it was Robert Hayes who appeared. His face was grim but not angry, and he looked between Eleanor and Clara with an expression that suggested he was trying to understand something that had previously been beyond his comprehension. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "your mother is having Catherine Collins administer smelling salts in the vestry. James is threatening to bring suit against Madame Rousseau's boutique for the distress this has caused. Half the guests have already departed, and the other half are standing in the church gossiping like fishwives. This is an unmitigated disaster." Eleanor waited for the anger, the recriminations, the demands that she return to the church and complete the ceremony regardless of her doubts. But instead, her father looked at her with something that might have been understanding. "However," he continued, "I watched you walk away from that altar, and I saw something in your face I have not seen since you were a small child. You looked free, Eleanor. Terrified, but free." The observation surprised Eleanor so much that she stopped crying. She had never thought of her father as particularly perceptive about emotional matters. He was a banker, a man of numbers and contracts and business arrangements. But perhaps there were depths to him that she had never explored because she had been too busy being the daughter he expected her to be. "That I cannot marry James," Eleanor said, making it official. "Not today, not ever. I do not love him, Papa. I respect him, I like him well enough, but I do not love him. And I have realized that is not enough for me." Robert nodded slowly, as if he had suspected this truth but had been waiting for Eleanor to articulate it. "Your mother will not easily accept this decision," he warned. "The social embarrassment alone will take months to overcome. The financial arrangements between our families will need to be unwound. You will be marked as the girl who ran from her own wedding, and that will affect your prospects. I know, Eleanor said. I am prepared to accept the consequences, but are you prepared to explain what comes next? Robert asked. Because people will want to know. They will want to know what you plan to do with your life if you are not to be Mrs. James Whitmore. Eleanor looked at Clara, who was still sitting quietly in the corner of the carriage, witnessing this family conversation with a discretion that suggested she understood when to remain silent. Then Eleanor looked back at her father and said something that surprised even herself. I want to work, she said. I want to do something meaningful with my life, something that is mine and not just an extension of the family name or social position. I want to decide for myself who I am and what I value. Robert Hayes absorbed this revolutionary statement from his eldest daughter with remarkable equanimity. Then he pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to Eleanor. This is a letter of introduction to a colleague of mine who runs the Women's Educational and Industrial Union on Chestnut Street, he said. They help women find employment and training. I wrote it last week, after I noticed how unhappy you seemed during the wedding preparations. I hoped I would not need to give it to you, but I kept it just in case. Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands, unable to believe what she was hearing. You knew I was unhappy? A father knows his child, Robert said simply. Even when that child is very good at pretending. He paused, then added, Your mother sees what she wants to see, Eleanor. She loves you, but she loves her vision of who you should be more than she loves the truth of who you are. I have been complicit in that, and I apologize. But I will help you now, if you will let me. The emotion that flooded through Eleanor was so intense that she could barely breathe. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her parents' approval, believing that their love was conditional on her obedience and success. To discover that her father had been quietly watching, understanding, and preparing to support her even in rebellion was almost more than she could process. Clara cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention. Miss Hayes, she said formally, I should return your family's pearls. They are far too valuable for me to accept, and honestly, I could not sell them even if I wanted to. They belong to your family's history, but Eleanor shook her head firmly. No, Claire. Keep them. Sell them if you need the money, or save them as a nest egg for your future with Daniel. Consider them a wedding gift, or perhaps compensation for the distress my family has caused you. Either way, they are yours now. Clara seemed about to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression must have convinced her. She nodded and carefully tucked the pearls into her handbag. Then perhaps, she said hesitantly, you would consider coming to my wedding next Saturday. Not as a guest of honor or anything formal, just as someone who shared in this strange day. I think Daniel would find the whole story quite amusing, and it would give us a chance to end on a better note than this. The invitation was so unexpected and generous that Eleanor felt fresh tears threatening. I would be honored, she said. Truly honored. Robert Hayes helped both women out of the carriage, and the three of them stood on the sidewalk in the light rain, an unlikely trio connected by circumstances none of them could have predicted. The church doors remained closed, but Eleanor could hear the sounds of voices inside, could imagine the conversations and accusations flying between her mother and the Whitmore family. That I should go back inside, Robert said, but he looked at Eleanor with concern. Will you be all right? Eleanor thought about the question, about all the ways she was decidedly not all right. Her wedding had been a disaster. She had humiliated herself and her family in front of Philadelphia society. She had broken an engagement that had taken months to arrange. She was wearing another woman's dress and standing in the rain without a clear plan for what came next, but she was also free. Free from a marriage that would have been wrong for her. Free from the weight of expectations that had been crushing her. Free to discover who she actually was beneath all the layers of proper behavior and social performance. I will be, Eleanor said, and she meant it. I do not know how, but I will be. Robert nodded, kissed her forehead, and walked back toward the church to face whatever chaos awaited inside. Eleanor watched him go, then turned to Clara. Would you help me out of this dress? I cannot bear to wear it another moment, and I certainly cannot return it to my mother's house like this. Clara laughed, a sound of genuine amusement despite everything. Come to my boarding house, she said. It is just a few blocks from here. I will help you change into something of mine, and then you can decide where you want to go from there. We can also collect those documents I mentioned, in case your mother or the Whitmores try to claim I was lying about the dress. The two women walked through the rain-dampened streets of Philadelphia, Eleanor still wearing the wedding dress and Clara beside her in her green dress and hat. They must have made a strange picture, but Eleanor found she did not care. For the first time in her life, she was walking towards something she had chosen rather than something that had been chosen for her, and that simple act felt revolutionary. Clara's boarding house was a respectable establishment on Walnut Street, clean and well-maintained but decidedly modest compared to the townhouses Eleanor was accustomed to. They climbed 3 flights of stairs to Clara's small room, which contained a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a single window that looked out over the street. It was a fraction of the size of Eleanor's bedroom in her parents' house, but there was something appealing about its simplicity, its lack of pretension. Clara helped Eleanor out of the wedding dress, the two of them working together to undo the dozens of tiny buttons that ran down the back. When the dress finally slipped off, Eleanor felt as though she were shedding not just a garment but an entire identity, the girl she had been expected to be. Clara hung the dress carefully in her wardrobe, treating it with the reverence it deserved, then offered Eleanor a simple cotton dress in navy blue, far plainer than anything Eleanor usually wore but clean and appropriate. While Eleanor dressed, Clara retrieved a folder from her desk drawer and showed Eleanor the papers inside. There was the receipt from Madame Rousseau's boutique, dated 4 months earlier, listing every specification of the dress. There were sketches that matched the gown exactly. There was correspondence between Clara and the dressmaker discussing the design elements. The evidence was incontrovertible. My address is on the receipt, Clara said. The boutique must have confused it with yours when they prepared the deliveries. Perhaps our names are similar in the order book, or perhaps there was just human error. Either way, the mistake has certainly caused more trouble than anyone could have imagined. Eleanor studied the papers, seeing evidence of Clara's careful planning and substantial financial sacrifice. 2 months' wages, Clara had said earlier. For someone working as a secretary, that represented a significant portion of annual income, saved and spent on a single garment for a single day. Eleanor, who had never had to consider the cost of anything she wanted, felt humbled by the magnitude of that commitment. Tell me about Daniel, Eleanor said, wanting to shift the conversation to something more positive. Tell me about the man you are marrying. Clara's face softened in a way that Eleanor had never seen on her own face when discussing James. Daniel is a carpenter, she said, working for a construction company that builds houses in the new developments west of the city. He is kind and funny and patient with my moods. He makes furniture in his spare time, beautiful pieces from cherry wood and oak. He made the writing desk in this room as a gift when I graduated from business college. We met at a church social 3 years ago, and I knew within an hour of conversation that he was the person I wanted to spend my life with. The contrast between Clara's description of her relationship and Eleanor's feelings toward James was stark and undeniable. Clara spoke with love and conviction, with the certainty that came from genuine connection rather than social calculation. Eleanor envied that certainty, that clarity of feeling. Does your family approve? Eleanor asked, curious about whether Clara had faced the same pressures about appropriate matches that Eleanor had experienced. Clara smiled. My family is small and practical. My mother died when I was 16, and my father works in a print shop. He likes Daniel because Daniel is honest and hardworking and makes me happy. That is all he cares about. We will not have a large wedding like you were meant to have today, just family and close friends. But it will be ours, chosen by us, reflecting who we actually are. The simplicity of Clara's approach to marriage and life seemed almost radical to Eleanor, who had been raised to believe that weddings were performances, marriages were strategic alliances, and personal happiness was a secondary consideration at best. But sitting in Clara's modest room, wearing Clara's plain dress, Eleanor wondered if perhaps the working class had a better understanding of what truly mattered than the aristocrats who looked down on them. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Clara opened it to find her landlady, Mrs. Patterson, a stout woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. Miss Brennan, she said, there is a young man downstairs asking after you. Says his name is Daniel Riley and that he received an urgent message. Clara's face lit up, and she hurried to follow Mrs. Patterson downstairs. Eleanor waited in the room, giving the couple a moment of privacy. She could hear their voices through the thin walls, hear Clara telling Daniel the incredible story of what had happened at the church. She heard Daniel's deep voice responding with concern and then laughter, heard him say something about how his Clara was braver than a whole battalion of soldiers. When Clara returned to the room, she was accompanied by a tall young man with dark curly hair and strong hands marked by his trade. Daniel Riley looked at Eleanor with friendly curiosity but no judgment. "So you are the runaway bride," he said with a smile. "Clara tells me you showed more courage today than most people show in a lifetime." The statement, so different from what Eleanor expected, made her want to cry again. She had anticipated condemnation or mockery, not admiration. "Thank you," she said simply. "And congratulations on your upcoming wedding. I hope it is everything you both dream it will be." Daniel squeezed Clara's hand. "As long as Clara is there," he said, "it will be perfect. The dress is just decoration. Beautiful decoration, mind you, but decoration nonetheless." The uncomplicated love between Clara and Daniel was so evident that Eleanor felt it like a physical presence in the room. This was what she had been missing with James, this sense of partnership and mutual delight. And now, having seen it, Eleanor knew she could never settle for less. 3 weeks after the interrupted wedding at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, Eleanor Hayes sat at a desk in the offices of the Women's Educational and Industrial Union on Chestnut Street, sorting through applications from young women seeking assistance with employment placement. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, as many of the applicants came from desperate circumstances, seeking any opportunity to support themselves or their families. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way that Eleanor's previous life of social calls and charity galas had never been. The letter of introduction from her father had opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed to a woman of Eleanor's class and limited experience. Mrs. Frances Wister, who directed the union's placement office, had been skeptical at first about hiring someone with no work history and obvious connections to Philadelphia's upper class. But Eleanor had insisted she wanted to learn, wanted to be useful, wanted to earn her place rather than have it granted by social position. Something in her earnestness must have convinced Mrs. Wister to take a chance on her. The first few days had been difficult. Eleanor knew nothing about the practical skills required for office work. She could barely type, her handwriting was decorative but slow, and she had no idea how to organize files according to any logical system. The other women in the office, mostly from working-class backgrounds, had watched her struggle with barely concealed amusement. But Eleanor had persisted, arriving early and staying late, asking questions without shame, and gradually learning the rhythms and requirements of gainful employment. What surprised Eleanor most was how much she enjoyed the work. Each application represented a real person with real needs, and when Eleanor successfully matched a woman with a suitable position, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been entirely absent from her previous life of social performance. She was helping women support themselves, achieve independence, escape difficult situations. The work mattered in ways that planning dinner parties and managing household staff never had. Her mother had not forgiven her for the wedding catastrophe. Catherine Hayes had taken to her bed for 3 days after the incident, claiming nervous exhaustion brought on by Eleanor's selfish and irrational behavior. When she finally emerged, she refused to speak to Eleanor directly, communicating only through terse notes left with the household staff. The Whitmore family had demanded reimbursement for the wedding expenses, and Robert Hayes had settled the matter quietly to avoid further scandal. James himself had left Philadelphia entirely, accepting a position with his uncle's banking firm in Boston, presumably to escape the gossip and humiliation. Eleanor had moved out of her parents' house and into a modest apartment in a respectable neighborhood, using money from a small trust fund that her grandmother had left specifically to her. The apartment was tiny by Eleanor's previous standards, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen, but it was hers, and that made it feel like a palace. She learned to cook simple meals, to wash her own clothes, to manage a household budget. Each new skill felt like a small victory in the larger battle for self-determination. Margaret, her younger sister, had been the only family member besides their father who maintained open communication with Eleanor. Margaret visited the apartment regularly, bringing news from the family home and social gossip from the circles Eleanor had left behind. The story of the interrupted wedding had spread through Philadelphia society like wildfire, with various embellished versions making Eleanor out to be everything from tragically mad to admirably brave. Some families had cut social ties with the Hayes family entirely, while others had expressed quiet support for Eleanor's decision to follow her heart rather than social convention. Through Margaret, Eleanor had learned that her mother was considering moving the family to New York for a season, hoping that distance and time would allow the scandal to fade. Robert Hayes had apparently refused this plan, stating that he would not flee Philadelphia like a criminal and that anyone who judged his daughter harshly for having the courage to be honest about her feelings was not worth knowing anyway. This defense had only increased the tension in the Hayes household, with Catherine believing her husband was enabling Eleanor's destructive behavior. But on this particular morning, Eleanor was not thinking about her mother's disappointment or Philadelphia society's judgment. She was thinking about the fact that today was Clara Brennan's wedding day, and Eleanor had been invited to attend the ceremony. The wedding was to be held at a small Catholic church in an Irish neighborhood south of Market Street, far from the grand Episcopal churches that served Eleanor's former social circle. Eleanor had chosen her outfit carefully for the occasion, wanting to be respectful of the setting while not appearing condescending in her choice. She wore a simple dress of gray wool with modest decoration, appropriate for a guest but not ostentatious. She carried a small gift, a set of embroidered dish towels that she had actually made herself, her first attempt at needlework that was intended for use rather than display. The morning's work at the Union passed quickly, and at noon Eleanor took her leave and made her way to the church where Clara and Daniel would exchange vows. The neighborhood was predominantly working class, the streets lined with narrow row houses and small shops. Children played on the sidewalks, and women chatted on their front steps, enjoying the mild spring weather that had finally replaced the gray uncertainties of early April. The church was smaller and simpler than St. Mark's, without the elaborate stained glass windows or carved stone details that marked it as a significant architectural statement. But it was clean and well-maintained, its simplicity somehow more honest than the aristocratic pretensions of Eleanor's former church. Eleanor slipped inside and took a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention to herself. The pews filled gradually with guests, families and friends of the bride and groom, dressed in their Sunday best but without the expensive fashions that had dominated Eleanor's ill-fated wedding. There was an energy to the gathering that felt different from the formal ceremonies Eleanor had attended in her previous life. People greeted each other warmly, children fidgeted in their seats, and there was a sense of genuine celebration rather than social performance. Clara appeared at the back of the church right on time, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the sight. Clara wore the wedding dress, the dress that had caused so much trouble 3 weeks earlier, and she was radiant. The dress fit her perfectly, every detail exactly as it should be, the embroidery catching the light, the lace framing her face beautifully. Clara carried a simple bouquet of white roses, and her face glowed with happiness that needed no artifice to enhance it. Daniel stood at the altar waiting for his bride, and the expression on his face when he saw Clara walking toward him made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. This was what love looked like, what marriage was supposed to be. Not a strategic alliance or social advancement, but two people choosing each other with full hearts and clear intention. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Latin by an elderly priest who had obviously known Clara's family for years. He spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, about the commitment to love through both joy and hardship, about the importance of building a life together on a foundation of mutual respect and faith. The words were not so different from those Reverend Thornton had been prepared to speak at Eleanor's wedding, but somehow they felt more meaningful in this setting, more connected to the real lives of the people involved. When Clara and Daniel exchanged their vows, their voices were steady and sincere. Eleanor heard the promises they made to each other and understood that these were not empty ritual words but genuine commitments that both intended to honor. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, and Daniel kissed Clara with such enthusiasm that the congregation laughed with delight, Eleanor felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The reception was held in the church hall, a modest space decorated with white streamers and spring flowers. There was food and music and dancing, celebration that was joyful without being ostentatious. Eleanor stayed near the edges of the gathering, not wanting to intrude on moments that belonged to Clara and Daniel and their community. But Clara found her during a break in the dancing and pulled her aside for conversation. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, her face flushed and happy. It means more than you might realize. After everything that happened, I was not sure we would ever see each other again, that I would not have missed it, Eleanor said honestly. I wanted to see you wear your dress the way it was meant to be worn, in the ceremony it was created for. You look absolutely beautiful, Clara smiled and gestured around the hall. It is not as grand as your wedding would have been, she said without judgment or envy. Then, oh, Eleanor agreed, but it is real, and that makes it better. The two women stood together watching Daniel greet guests, his arm constantly seeking Clara out to pull her close, his joy obvious and unguarded. Have you been all right these past weeks? Clara asked with genuine concern. I heard through the neighborhood that there was quite a scandal, Eleanor nodded. There was and continues to be in some quarters. My mother will not speak to me, and I have been effectively banished from the social circle I grew up in. But I have a job that I find meaningful, an apartment of my own, and a sense of purpose I never had before. So yes, I am all right. Better than all right, actually. What kind of work do you do? Clara asked curiously. Eleanor explained about the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, about helping other women find employment and independence. She talked about the challenges of learning office skills and navigating a world she had never been prepared for by her privileged upbringing. She spoke about the satisfaction of doing work that mattered, that helped people in concrete ways. Clara listened with interest and growing respect. That is remarkable, she said when Eleanor finished. Most women in your position would have returned to their families, accepted the limitations of their situation, and eventually made another acceptable match. You chose a harder path, a brave path that I am not sure it was bravery so much as desperation, Eleanor admitted. I knew I could not go back to who I was before. That person felt like a costume I had been wearing, and once I took it off, I could not put it back on again. Sometimes desperation and bravery look very similar, Clara observed. Either way, you made a choice to be honest about who you are and what you want from life. That takes strength. Daniel appeared at Clara's side, claiming his bride for another dance. Before she was pulled away, Clara squeezed Eleanor's hand. Come visit us sometime, she said. Once Daniel and I are settled in our new apartment. I think we could be friends, do you not? Real friends, not just women connected by a strange day and a dress. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. I would like that very much, she said. As the reception continued, Eleanor found herself in conversation with several of Clara and Daniel's friends, young working-class couples building lives together with limited resources but abundant hope. They asked Eleanor about her work at the union, curious about what opportunities might be available for women they knew. Eleanor found herself making promises to follow up, to see what positions might be suitable, to use her new connections to help where she could be. By the time Eleanor left the church hall, the spring evening had turned cool and clear, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She walked through the unfamiliar neighborhood toward the streetcar stop that would take her back to her own part of the city, carrying the sense of a day well spent, a celebration properly witnessed. When she reached her small apartment, Eleanor found a letter waiting for her, slipped under the door by someone during her absence. The handwriting was her father's, and she opened it with curiosity and some apprehension. Inside was a brief note and a substantial bank draft. The note read, Eleanor, your mother remains intractable, but I am proud of the choices you have made and the person you are becoming. I have established a small trust in your name, sufficient to cover your living expenses while you find your footing in this new life. Use it wisely, use it well, but know that you have my support regardless of what path you choose. Your courage has reminded me of qualities I had forgotten in myself. With love and admiration, your father. Eleanor sat at her small table and cried, not from sadness but from relief and gratitude. She had lost much in the past 3 weeks. Her social standing, her family's approval, the comfortable security of a prescribed future. But she had gained something more valuable, autonomy, purpose, and the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. She thought about Clara and Daniel, beginning their married life with love and hope. She thought about the women who came through the doors of the union seeking help and opportunity. She thought about her own journey from being a bride in the wrong dress to being a woman choosing her own path. The dress that had caused such chaos had ultimately been a gift, forcing Eleanor to see the difference between what she was supposed to want and what she actually needed. It had been a catalyst for transformation, Turning what should have been her wedding day into the first day of her real life, Eleanor went to her small desk and began writing letters, reaching out to contacts her father had provided, exploring possibilities for expanding the union services, considering what other ways she might help women navigate toward independence and self-determination. The work was daunting, the path uncertain, but Eleanor felt more alive and more herself than she ever had, wearing expensive dresses and attending society events. Somewhere in Philadelphia, Clara and Daniel were beginning their marriage, wearing their own dreams and building their own future. And somewhere else in the city, Eleanor was doing the same, no longer defined by what she wore or who she was supposed to marry, but by the choices she made and the work she did and the woman she was becoming. The story of the interrupted wedding would be told for years in Philadelphia society, embellished and moralized and interpreted according to the prejudices of different tellers. But for Eleanor, the truth was simpler and more profound. She had worn another woman's dress and, in doing so, had discovered that the life she had been wearing was also not her own. And having made that discovery, she had made the hardest and best choice of her life, to stop pretending and start living authentically, whatever that might cost. The spring night settled over Philadelphia, and Eleanor Hayes sat at her desk in her small apartment, writing plans for a future she would create herself, finally wearing a life that fit. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.